Okay, we should be good.
All right.
Okay. This is probably one of the favorite parts of a program is start talking about wildlife. And we're fortunate to have Amy Weldon. She's a wildlife biologist with the Potomac Conservancy, which is a land trust organization that buys easements or accepts donated easements.
Donated easements.
On properties, and so that they're kept in a natural state for perpetuity. But she actually developed this presentation a while back, and actually I think the first time she's actually presented it. So we'll go on from there, and I'll follow up with this. And like I said, we should easily be out a very reasonable amount of time. So urge you to hang in there. Okay, Amy, thanks for being here.
Thank you, and thanks for having me, everybody. Try to ignore all the wires. I feel like I have a bomb that's about to go off. But yeah, my name is Amy, and I work for Potomac Conservancy. And wildlife is actually not the focus of what I do at the Conservancy. We're a water quality organization, and so we work on land protection projects and a variety of restoration projects to improve water quality. But wildlife is actually my personal passion, and I've worked for a number of organizations, including Defenders of Wildlife and the National Audubon Society, prior to my position at Potomac Conservancy, and just kind of do it as a hobby in my own backyard. So I feel pretty knowledgeable about what it takes to bring wildlife into your property, and what kind of habitat elements you should create or enhance to do that. And this presentation is going to be kind of a mix of like the larger concepts, and then also I'm going to enforce those concepts with my own backyard, a case study of my own backyard, to kind of show you that it is possible, because I live in a pretty small, third of an acre property in suburban Silver Spring, and we have some pretty impressive wildlife that's come into our backyard because of some of the things that we've done. So I'm going to kind of switch back and forth between those two different tracks. So here's kind of the basics of what we're going to cover today. Basic fundamentals, where do you start when you're thinking about wildlife management? Then go into the details of how do you actually attract wildlife to your property once you figure out what it is that you want to attract. And then how to go about planning and looking at your property from kind of a large scale down to a very small scale, and what types of elements you need to do to improve your property. And then finally, a little bit on keeping wildlife safe. And that'll make more sense once we get there, what that actually means. So the first thing you're going to want to do is think about your property and understand that different wildlife have different size requirements. So there are some species that have very large habitat requirements in terms of acreage. So if we're talking about grassland birds or grassland species or forest interior species, these are groups of species that need very large habitat blocks if you want to actually see them on your property. So if you're thinking, I want to create habitat for rare grassland birds, and you've only got 3 acres in a sea of otherwise forested or mixed use land, you're probably not going to see that. So you might want to abandon that idea and move towards something else, where you have a higher likelihood of seeing some interesting species. So you're probably planting grass, if you've only got that amount of habitat, is not the best use of your time or money. If you have a smaller property, though, they can, and it abuts other property with good habitat, your property can serve as a buffer or as a connecting piece between those two areas. So in that case, if you have a small property, it functionally acts like a larger piece of habitat if it's increasing the size of existing habitat that somebody else owns. So think about those things when you're deciding what it is that you want to see on your property and what you should manage for. If, as most people have in the current landscape today in Maryland, woodland, edge, and successional species or successional habitats, then you can attract a variety of different of wildlife that use what we consider to be edge habitats, basically that confluence of two different habitats that come together. And these species don't need such big habitat blocks. They've specialized in these smaller little areas where they can get their needs met without needing a whole lot of habitat. So that's probably what most people are going to be focusing on, unless you have a really nice piece of habitat, either forest or grassland. Other things that you can focus on is migratory animals. Migratory birds especially require stopover habitat. I mean, these are birds that fly literally thousands of miles, almost nonstop, some of them, from their wintering grounds up in, let's say, northern Canada down to sometimes South America, or even the tip of South America. And so they need a lot of good places to stop along the way to rest and what we call refuel. So if you have good habitat and you only have a small property, you can still attract some of these really interesting species that are just coming through for a day or a week or something that just need to hang out and have some good food and some time, a safe place to be to eat, so that they can keep on flying. And as an example, this is a magnolia warbler. This is the map here you can see shows this is the summer range. They mostly hang out in the boreal coniferous forests of Canada and the northeast US. This is their migratory path. This whole area you can see them through when they're migrating between their winter and summer grounds, and then they winter down here in Central America. So this bird needs really large blocks of coniferous forest. However, I have seen this bird in my backyard on numerous occasions during migration, because they need a good place. They don't care what it looks like, they just need food. So if you can provide good food and good shelter, then you'll see some of these really cool species if you're looking for them. And it doesn't have to be the same habitat that they use in their breeding or in the wintering seasons. And then also think about, getting back to the size, understanding what habitat these species require. So if you're thinking about a bear, you're going to need large blocks of wood, or you're not going to attract bears to your property. Some people have bears and they don't want bears on their property. But if you really want to see bears, unless your property adjoins a large piece of wood, or you have one yourself, you're probably not going to see them. Thinking about a bobwhite quail, this is a species that's really crashed. Their populations are just not doing very well. But if the landscape has the right mix and abundance of the habitats that they need, you still can find them. So a lot of people try to manage for quail, but it's really hard to get quail into your property if the landscape doesn't have this nice balance of all these different habitat types. So about half of it should be cropland, because they use that for certain behaviors or certain times of the year. Another part, 25 to 30% should be grassland. Then you need some of this shrubby stuff where they can run over and get in there for cover if they need to run away from something. And then some woodland. So all of these different habitats, they forage in some places, they display in some places, they raise their young in other places, they hide in other places. So managing your landscape for bobwhite quail can actually be kind of tricky. And so sometimes it's not the best use of resources if you have a landscape that doesn't contain a lot of these elements. They're still reasonably common out on places like the Eastern Shore, where there's a lot of this kind of scrubby stuff coming up, and an ag landscape interspersed with wild and overgrown areas with some woodlands. And so, if you have a landscape like that, then sure, that'll work. Thinking about things like a wood frog, where you see them usually, or where you associate frogs in your mind with habitat, which is usually like a little vernal pool like this in the woods for a wood frog. May not be what they use in the wintertime. So this is where you see them breeding, but in the wintertime, they actually go up into the uplands, and you don't find them anywhere near the water in the non-breeding season. And so, if you can create a vernal pool breeding area in the spring, make sure that you've got some nice upland for them to hang out in the winter, so that you're meeting their needs. And this is just kind of a table that shows some of the different abundance and home range sizes for the most common wildlife that you might see around here. So like if you look at a robin, they have a pretty small home range, 1,320 feet around a nest site. As you talked about, black bears, approximately 70 per 100 square miles, so really big home range. Obviously, you can get a lot of chipmunks in an acre. Rabbits and these smaller mammals, you can get a lot of those in an acre. So think about attracting these guys if you've got a smaller acreage rather than the black bear. I like black bears. And then also think about edge effect when you want to attract wildlife. And you hear in a lot of the older wisdom on attracting wildlife in some of the old literature is that, create these edges because wildlife love edges, and you're going to see all this great abundance of wildlife at the edge. And that's absolutely true. But what you want to do to create a high quality edge, though, is take these, what we call hard edges, which is what we often see in the landscape where someone's mowing straight to an edge of a woodlot, and then you have this very abrupt change to a new habitat. That's called a hard edge because it feels hard. What you want to do if you want to get good wildlife in those edges and also make it safer for the wildlife to be in those edges is to create what we call a soft edge. And so this is kind of this gradual transition from that mowed lawn area into a kind of grassy area, into a shrubby area, into a young forest, into an old forest. So that creates a whole lot of different habitat niches that can support a variety of different species and give them good cover for, if a predator is, because oftentimes what predators will do is they'll hang out along those edges and just, if it's a raccoon or something that eats bird nests, they'll just follow that edge and knock out any bird nests that they see. If you got a nice soft edge, it's a lot harder for them to develop that search image and find those nests because there's a lot more hiding spots, a lot more cover, so those birds can hang out and have a reproductive season that's a little bit safer from predators that tend to focus on those edges. So edges are really good for wildlife. However, don't create them if you don't have to. So if you don't have an existing edge, don't create a new one. The habitat, the historical habitat in Maryland in this area is generally oak hickory forest. So if you looked before there was human colonization of this area, it was dominated by a woodland habitat. And so I'm always of the philosophy that I always try to get back to that more natural state rather than changing it to something new if you can, because that's what's supposed to be here. Those plants, those animals have adapted to be here. Unfortunately, the modern landscape in Maryland and in most places in the country is much more cut up than that. So we've got a lot of edges. You can see edges all over in here. There's edges here, 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 here. There's edges everywhere. So we don't need new edges. So try not to cut forests for the sake of creating edges to attract more wildlife, because you probably already have edges to work with. So instead of creating new ones, take the existing edges that you have, which are probably going to be hard edges, and make them soft and make them really good for wildlife. So yeah, just so that would be the take-home message there, is wherever possible, enhance the edges that you have or reduce the edges that you have. So if you have like a forest gap or something and you have the opportunity to bring it back to that historical oak hickory woodland, then bring it back to that woodland. And in the process, as those trees that you plant in that gap start to grow up, you're going to get all kinds of neat wildlife in the whole 10 or 15, 20 years that it takes to grow up into a canopy. You're going to get this whole series of different wildlife that come and visit your new habitat. But you're also kind of increasing the contiguity and the connectedness of the landscape, which is always a good thing. If you have an agricultural field, you could consider things like field borders. So these are like 50 to 100 foot border strips around the perimeter of a field, which usually is a hard edge at that point. So you have a field and then you have either a hedgerow or you have a forest. And just create this little buffer zone of grassy areas. These are usually grassy. If you want, you can let them grow up. They actually do not reduce productivity very much. I mean, some studies show not at all. Some studies show they may even enhance it, because what happens when you have a field that goes right up to a forest edge is that the strip of crop that borders that forest area is actually getting shaded out by the trees, for one, and it's competing for water and nutrients from the roots of those trees, which are much more competitive than the roots of a typical crop plant. So if you have this nice, soft, grassy buffer between your productive areas and your forest, then you're actually giving your cropland more of a competitive edge to be able to use the water and the resources that are there and not compete for sunlight. And if you need to, then you can always turn those buffers back to production if for some reason you need to. It's very easy. You just till them right under again. So another thing, minimize your footprint. So and one thing that is easy to do, which I think you probably talked about this morning a little, is just stop mowing. Nature will take its course. It will, aside from the invasive species that you have to keep an eye on, succession will happen, and you'll naturally go through these phases of different plant communities. So you don't want something that looks like a park. You ideally don't want to have, a bunch of mature trees with a mowed lawn underneath them. I mean, you're going to have some nice canopy there, and you're going to have birds using that canopy, but you're not going to maximize the amount of wildlife that you could actually get on your property if you have a park-like situation. So think about messiness. Wildlife love messiness. Humans hate messiness. So you have to balance that tension there, where you've got people who say, well, that looks terrible. I don't want to see that out my door, and also the needs of wildlife that actually need that's something that some humans think looks terrible. I personally think it looks beautiful when an area is overgrown and kind of messy. But I know a lot of people don't share that view. So you've got to kind of, there's an education process there of trying to bring people up to the value of these areas, that they're not just overgrown places that have no value. They actually do have a lot of value, and you can enhance the look of them, planting more flowers, putting in a little trail. Sometimes just putting a sign up on something changes people's opinion of it. If it just looks like an overgrown field, people think that looks like crap. If you say, this is certified wildlife habitat, then people are like, oh. And they actually stop and they look at it. And they start seeing things. They start seeing the details instead of just this larger, weedy patch. So that's something you can do, or putting a trail through it. Putting a trail through it automatically brings people into it, and they automatically assign more value to it than there was before that trail was there. These are just this is actually my backyard in Silver Spring, just an example of some of the messiness. This is our little trail that heads back to our compost pile, and it's not neat and tidy. This is just, we have occasionally we clear out stuff in the yard and we just throw it into little brush piles here and there, and so this is just an example of a little, I think those were poke plants that we cut down at the end of the season and just piled them in there, and a couple times I've scared 2 rabbits out of this little pile right here. It's only like 1 foot tall, and little rabbits were hanging out in there. And allow some native weeds. So an example of this would be poke. This is a phytolacca plant. Some of you are probably familiar with it. It has, you can see up here, the purple berries, lots of copious purple berries. Sometimes if they've got them, yeah, if you've got birds, they will poop all over your car and it'll be purple. Some people don't like that, but birds love them, and they're just an abundant amount of berries available in the fall time when a lot of birds are migrating and need a lot of berries. So if you can kind of balance the human needs with the wildlife, it's a good plant to keep around, and obviously it grows on its own and it is kind of weedy, so you do have to stay on top of it if you don't want it to completely overtake everything, but it's a good weed to have around. Yeah?
I'm thinking of Pollinator in Silver Spring. How do your neighbors feel about your messy backyard?
Well, it looks nice. I'll show you pictures later on. When we first moved in, our neighbor is actually a horticulturalist, a professional horticulturalist. So he has a very manicured yard. Every plant is labeled, and I didn't see any poke in the backyard when we first moved, and I found one in the front yard, and so I transplanted it to the backyard. And he was out in the backyard doing his stuff, and he's like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "Oh, well, have you ever heard of poke?" And he's like, "That's a weed." I'm like, "Yeah, well, I'm planting it." But we have good relationships with our neighbors, and it actually our yard does look nice. We don't let it, you do have to balance that. Like, you can't just let it go crazy, but there are ways that you can kind of meet both needs. And then also think about connectivity. So always think about not just your property, but how your property fits in on the larger landscape. So wildlife need habitat to be connected, to be able to safely disperse across the landscape, to find other mates, to breed, to just forage and find new habitat, and also just on the broader scale, maintaining genetic diversity. If animals are able to move across the landscape, then you can exchange genes very easily across the landscape and not end up with a lot of problems. So if you have a stream, great way to start with connectivity. They're just natural dispersal corridors for most wildlife, birds, mammals, everything. They just like to hang out near water and move across the landscape along a stream. So if you've got a stream, enhance your stream and make it more higher habitat value so that they can disperse. Other small properties, like if you're a small property and if you kind of zoom out and look at the surrounding landscape and you see that you've got a park up here and you've got something else over here, then maybe you're the link between those two, or you're part of the link, and so you can help build a bridge between two habitat hubs by creating that connectivity on your property. And then I always think about creating new habitat. Obviously, when you want to plant things, you want to plant native species. So think about native trees that are good for wildlife. And this is generally any native tree, but mostly native trees that either produce flowers, berries, fruits, or nuts. So if it's native, something native will eat it. So I just listed some examples here: dogwoods, holly, spicebush, sumac. Serviceberry is actually one of my favorites because it produces fruit, I'd say, by May. And so it's producing fruit just at the time when all the birds are going back north. I'm a bird person, if you haven't noticed. So all the birds are coming back north, and I've seen a serviceberry before with 5 different species of thrush feeding on it all at the same time. And 3 or 4 of those were migratory species that were just coming through. And so they just go nuts over these serviceberries. So that's one of my favorites. Viburnums are good. They produce a tremendous amount of berries, and they are deer resistant. Not deer proof. I have had some of my viburnums chopped pretty heavily, but they do leave some of them alone. And then oaks, hickories, walnuts, your typical trees that produce big heavy crops of large nuts. And black gum produces a lot of nice berries for birds too. And then when you're thinking about where to plant, always think about building on to what's already there. So you want to enhance what your existing forests or your existing stream corridors, like we talked about in the connectivity slide. And then, you know, the mast trees are the ones that I listed at the bottom there. And mast is just basically a fancy word for saying, you know, large native forest trees that produce food for wildlife. I mean, that's basically what it is. It's just forest trees that produce nuts and berries. So your oaks, your hickories, your walnuts, your beeches. On the berry side, cherries, crabapples, hackberries. So just think of, you know, you talked about the Chesapeake, the Fish and Wildlife Service Chesapeake Native Plants for, I forget the title, but it's a very nice book that has all the plants in the Chesapeake Bay watershed that are native that you can plant in certain areas, and it divides it into, you know, soil types and coastal, mountain, Piedmont zones. That's a really good book to have when you're trying to think about a reference to figure out what you should plant. Yeah?
Is that available again? Because I keep my copy in a very safe place.
Yeah.
Probably online.
I would think online.
But that's a big book to, I mean, if you were just going to reference it online, it'd be all right, but if you wanted it as a book, it would be.
I have it as a book. It's only about this fat. It's like a magazine. Yeah.
Too big to print out.
Yeah, it's too big to print. And there's also, and I don't know the web address off the top of my head, but they have converted the information from that book into an online database where you can say, I live in the coastal plain, I have sandy soil, I have a partial shade, partial sun area that I want to plant, what plants fit that description, and it'll sort it for you and give you the list of plants. And you'll just have to probably Google around to find the address, because I can't remember it off the top of my head. But it's a great resource, and I've tested it, because I know I do a lot of plantings, and I know what should go where, and I've tested it a couple times, and it spits out what I would put in those places. So check that out too. And then always encourage new natural tree recruitment. One way that you can do this is when you plant your trees, stop mowing after a couple years or so. And when you stop mowing, you allow those trees to naturally come up in between. So you don't end up with a forest that's just your rows of trees that you planted, but something that looks a little bit more natural. So that's something you should also think about. Park the mower, allow the new trees to come up. And try to convert your lawn to natural cover whenever possible. So this is, again, my backyard. And when we moved in, this is what it looked like. Well, this is probably a couple years after we moved in. We've done lots of different enhancements here already. But this yellow line here is an area of lawn that was full of Japanese stilt grass, and I was just tired of it overtaking the lawn. And so we actually just took that whole section of lawn and converted it to new shrubs and trees and perennials. And that is the same area after we planted it, about 6 months after we planted it, to new shrubs and trees, and I have some updated photos at the end of this presentation. So now we don't have to mow that area, and it looks really nice, and we've seen more wildlife since we put it in. Think about creating habitat islands. Islands add a lot of diversity, they add little niches, they also provide escape cover. This is also my property. We have a nice corner lot, it's a 1/3 of an acre corner lot. And these two islands, they're kind of overgrown, and there are some invasives in there. We've removed as much as we could, but there's still a lot of privet that we have to figure out what to do with. But these areas, they have our little rabbit family, produces little bunnies every year. They hang out in there. Lots of birds use it. It's just really good escape cover. And wildlife feels safe if they don't have to traverse a really long stretch of non-habitat, because they just feel really vulnerable. And when you have these little islands, they can kind of jump from place to place if they're crossing your lawn and feel safer. And then think about, this is another one about creating lawn by converting, or creating habitat by converting your lawn or your field to trees. And so, you know, a lot of our properties look like this because they used to be farms, and then they were converted into residential lots. And you end up with a lot of old pasture that is now just lawn, and you're like, okay, I just mowed the lawn, but you actually can go and convert all of that lawn area to forest if you want. And then thinking about kind of more on the micro scale, what are the specific features that wildlife are attracted to? And one of the features that they like is dead wood. Dead wood comes in a lot of different forms. It could be a standing snag. These are great for woodpeckers. Woodpeckers, often hear people say, well, the woodpecker's killing my tree. Like, no, your tree was already dead. The woodpecker is eating all the bugs that are now infesting your tree. So they're a great food source for woodpeckers, because this wood is getting eaten up by a lot of beetles and grubs and things, and they hear them in there, and they peck them out. Also, dead branches on live trees are really great places for birds to perch. They love it. This is our backyard again. These are our dogwood trees. They all have anthracnose. They're all dying. But we haven't taken them down because the birds just flock to these little spindly perches that stick out of the live parts of the trees. So great perch points. If you have big enough trees with big enough holes and a big enough habitat to support a bear, den trees are kind of becoming in short supply. I did visit someone's property once who wanted some advice about wildlife, and she was all excited because she had a bear that she'd seen 10 years ago when they moved into the property, when this whole area was getting converted to residential neighborhood. And sure enough, on her property, there's this big den tree for a bear. But she's like, well, I haven't seen a bear since then. And it's because the forest got carved up into little pieces, and there was no longer habitat for that bear, even though she still had this beautiful den tree that was reminiscent of when it was good, contiguous forest habitat. So if you do have the opportunity to create this kind of habitat, definitely do, because it's becoming more in short supply. And also deadfall. This picture here is a log with a salamander in it. A lot of the wood that falls in the forest becomes habitat very quickly, and the longer it sits there and the more rotten it gets, the more likely it is to support a beautiful little microcosm of critters. And sometimes if you walk through the woods, you can see dead wood along the trails, and if you just kick it over with your foot, you'll find salamanders under there, all kinds of crazy insects, like there's all kinds of stuff going on under there. So if it falls, let it lie. A lot of people, because of our inclination to make things tidy, want to pick up everything that falls and cart it away so that it looks neater. But if you leave it there, it's going to create more opportunity for wildlife to come in and use it. And I love salamanders. If you don't have any snags, you can always make them. Try not to take your big, beautiful black gum and make it into a snag. But if you've got like a tree of heaven or something hanging around that you don't want there, you can make it into a snag instead. And it's a win-win for everybody except the tree of heaven. One way to do it is to mechanically girdle the tree. And I think in your workbook there's step-by-step instructions about how to do this. So I won't go into all the details here, but basically you're cutting away a fat strip of bark around the entire length of or entire width of the tree, or circumference of the tree, so that it can't continue to transport nutrients and water up the tree, and that'll kill the tree over time and give yourself a nice snag. You can also do herbicides, and I have a later slide that kind of shows this cutting technique where you can cut and then use herbicide in the cut. Hack and squirt, they call it. Another thing you always want to consider is invasive species. You don't want to do a lot of habitat restoration and then forget about it, because you're always going to have these invasives that are much stronger and more willful than you are. So you have to stay on top of them. It never goes away. You can get rid of invasives, but you will always have to maintain after that. It's a lot of work at first, but then hopefully it's less work over time. Especially in this area of the vines. The vines are terrible. I feel like the vines are going to take over the world one day, because there's just honeysuckle, the English ivy, the porcelain berry is pretty bad, and the mile-a-minute lately has become a really serious invader. So always clear away your invasives first. Make sure that you're working with as blank of a slate as possible before you start doing your habitat restorations. So once you control your invasives, then you can come behind and fill in with your natives, and then just do the maintenance. Like from then on, it's just maintaining, and it shouldn't take as much time. And here's how to apply the herbicide. So you do the cut stump or the hack and squirt, they call it. Hack and squirt works great for tree of heaven. You can just slice a little notch into the tree. Use a good axe, mostly for safety than anything else. I mean, it'll cut you a nice notch, but bad axes are like bad knives. The most injuries happen with an unsharp axe or knife. So use a good axe, and you can use Garlon or Roundup for these, and that should kill your tree without you having to cut it down and cart it away. Other things that you can bring onto your property to bring wildlife are brush piles. Brush piles are great. They provide lots of cover. They provide nest sites and loafing, which is just a fancy way of saying hanging out. This is this is the tail here of a little wren, and you can see his head in here. This is our little brush pile in the backyard, so I managed to snap that picture of the wren as he was going in and poking around looking for insects in the brush pile. And this is also our brush pile in the backyard. So they don't have to be, out, front and center. Everyone can be like, why is that big pile of ugly wood in your yard? They can be kind of tucked away. The wildlife will find them, and you can still have happy neighbors. So to build them, it's not rocket science. You don't even have to do it this way. Our brush pile, we pretty much just throw everything that we have on the brush pile, and we don't pay attention to protocol, and it still works. But if you want to build a real brush pile, you would take the base logs would be the bigger, your coarser materials, so your larger logs. And if you've just got stuff that you need to clean up around your property, putting them into a brush pile is a great way to use them instead of sending them to the wood chipper. And so do a crisscross pattern because you want to create these little gaps so that critters can get under there and have space. Different size critters can go under there. About 6-inch openings, but it doesn't really matter. On top, that's when you're going to pile your weeds and your smaller branches and other things to create kind of a denser top. So it ends up kind of looking like a beaver lodge in some ways. And it's ideal to have this near water and other habitat features so that, like oftentimes I'll see our chipmunks, which use our brush piles extensively, come from the brush pile, run out to underneath the bird feeder, gather some nuts, and then go back to the brush pile. They're very skittish, and they like to have that sense of security that they can hide really quickly should a hawk come by over the yard or something. So the arrangement of your habitat elements is really important. And again, this is our backyard, and our brush piles are tucked away back there. So they don't look bad. Water is a huge draw. If you can create water or have water on your property, enhance it and make it front and center, because that will bring in your wildlife like crazy, especially birds, but everything else too. I mean, we've had possums and foxes and stuff use our water. In our yard, we use just little shallow plates that we put on the ground because they especially like the shallow water. They don't really go to the deeper bird baths like you would expect them to. They actually like the shallow stuff because then they can get in there and they can bathe and they can, feel they can hop across it, and so it just tends to attract more wildlife than the deeper water. Yes.
How about mosquitoes?
We don't have too much of a mosquito problem, but we change our water baths frequently. So as long as you don't have any stagnant open sources of water, like we have a rain barrel, we put a top on it and make sure that stuff can't get in there. We periodically dump it out. If we see larvae in there, we'll dump it out. But really where you end up with a lot of mosquitoes is like if you've got a tire or something that you don't really even know is there, or a bucket that's on its side or something, like they will hang out in anything that is sitting there. What's that?
Clogged gutter.
Or a clogged gutter, yeah. So it's the secret water that is usually the breeding ground for mosquitoes. The stuff that we actually use as our habitat features has changed so regularly, we don't have that problem from them, but that's where they usually come from. And then creating density and thickets, allowing brush to develop in the understory, like we said. You don't want it to look like a park if you want wildlife. Only mow the areas that you really need, and then let the other stuff grow. And then another thing people don't think about is pollinator habitat. I mean, everyone loves to see the butterflies and everything, but there's also a lot of native bees and other pollinators that are declining because their habitat is declining. So, if you have the opportunity to create habitat for them, do so. And the way to do that is to create a diversity of plants, and then you want them so that they're flowering collectively all season. So not just the spring or not just the summer, but you want to have some stuff that blooms every month of the year during the entire breeding season so that you can keep them around and keep them coming back. So you don't want them all coming to your yard and then suddenly there's a crash and there's no food left for them. And also a place to nest and lay their eggs nearby. And oftentimes pollinators actually nest in the ground more than they nest anywhere else. 70% of the native bees nest in the ground, and 30% of them nest in like old dead wood. So here's another great use for a snag, is for native bees to nest inside the snag. And if you have like a little bare patch of ground, that's great because they love to burrow in underneath the ground, and that's where they breed, surprisingly. And here's just a couple different examples of ways that you can create pollinator nesting opportunities. So this is a pollinator nest box. It's just got holes of different sizes, and they can just, whatever size they are, they can fit into the right one. It's best to have it facing south or east into the morning sun, so that they're kind of cold-blooded animals in a way. They're not blooded, but they need the sun to kind of get themselves warmed up and going again. And you'll hear bees in there sometimes. Actually, you'll hear them kind of like getting their wings going and kind of buzzing a little bit before they actually are able to warm up enough to take flight. So the sun helps them do that. Or if you have just some little bamboo sticks, just stick them into a little crevice underneath your porch or an overhang or something, and you'll get pollinators in there. And a lot of the native bees, they don't usually sting. Bees, I think, are unfortunately unfairly maligned. Some of them do sting, but usually if you're not directly over their nest and really pestering them, they're not going to bother you. So just to kind of recap that, all of the different elements that you want on your property, you're going to want kind of in an arrangement where they're accessible to each other. So you're going to want to have some food, maybe some bird feeders, cover like a brush pile, some sort of water source. If you don't have a natural one, create one. And ideally, but not necessary, a place for nesting sites, like a habitat island or something. And now for the planning piece. Always think about your property at the landscape level and act at the property level. So this is just a generic aerial view that I pulled off of Google Earth. It's not anybody's property that I know of. And so what you would do if this was your property is you might think about, okay, well, thinking about the fact that this landscape used to be an oak hickory forest, first of all, how can I piece the landscape back together again? And so you might say, well, here's a nice big block of forest, and there's a nice little block of forest. So maybe what I could do is fill in that little gap there. And then that creates another block of forest on the landscape that didn't used to be there and connects this piece to that piece, and also that piece. Or you can see that you've got a stream here. So you've got a stream running through. It's an unbuffered stream. Right now there's no trees in the stream at all. Great dispersal corridor, great opportunity to enhance habitat. So maybe you want to put some trees in that area and reforest that This is my property, the little A for Amy. This is Sligo Creek Parkway. It's our little urban park that's within walking distance of our house, probably an eighth of a mile away. And so, you wouldn't think our property is all that attractive to anything, really. But Sligo Creek is a good stopover place for migratory birds to come through. There's foxes that hang out in there. There's way too many deer. So there's a lot of opportunity here for a suburban landscape. It's limited, of course, because this is a suburban landscape, but there's still opportunity. There always is. And so that's just kind of we didn't actually go through that official planning process, but we did have in the back of our minds, well, we do have Sligo Creek, we have an opportunity to get some cool stuff here. And then think about, well, what should you manage for? And so you're going to first think about your landscape perspective. Where are you in relation to other things? And then what it is that you really want to see. And so it's actually a lot easier to manage for habitat than it is for individual species. Because individual species all have their own different habitat requirements, but if you have good habitat, you're going to get whatever needs that habitat. So that's just the best way. If you say, I want to enhance my edge, or I really want to make my woodlands better, or I have a wetland that I want to enhance, then just focus on making good habitat and don't worry about what each individual species needs. Because you can't manage for everything. You just can't. You can only manage for certain things given the resources that you have, the raw materials that you have available. And then avoid attracting deer. They're terrible for habitat. These two graphs here, well, I guess this first picture here is you can see the deer browse line. A lot of our forests, most of our forests, I would argue, look like this now. Everything that a deer can reach is browsed. There's no understory, and people have forgotten that a forest is supposed to have an understory because this is what we're so used to seeing. And so, this graph here shows that as the percent ground cover decreases, as the deer density increases, the ground cover decreases. So they basically eat all the ground cover away. There's a lot of birds that require, and small mammals that require ground cover for nesting and being successful in the breeding season, so they're not openly accessible to predators. And so this graph here shows that as deer density increases, the number of songbirds declines. And that's largely because they eat all of the cover away and the food away from songbirds. So try not to attract deer if at all possible. Don't throw corn in the backyard or other things that that deer like. They're going to come find you anyway. But just try not to do anything that is going to increase their abundance. Okay, back to my property. This is our lot. This is what the raw materials that we had to work with. So we had 2 overgrown habitat islands on the property. We had this large area in the back of invaded vegetation. It was just like honeysuckle forest back there when we actually rent this property, but it was just all honeysuckle and English ivy back there. We had areas in the front that were not being used as gardens, but that could be for pollinators. We had several different snags or dead branches on living trees that we could use as snags. And so this is what we did. So in the front, we planted a lot of wildflowers, just a native seed mix of flowering plants. This is the back. I spent probably 1.5 years getting all the honeysuckle out of there and cutting out some of the overgrown. There were areas where there was just too many native trees. We thinned them out so that the best ones have the most chance of success. We have these habitat islands that we just cleared out of vines, but we left the privet in there. Added bird feeders. This is our little, we have a stump that we just put one of these little plates of water on. And oftentimes if you put a little rock in there, they love it. They'll sit on top of the rock and they'll drink off the rock. The rock seems to be essential. So put a rock in your water bath. And then we added little other rocks. We added downed wood. We added native plants. Things like this. Just threw rocks around wherever possible just to create some new habitat. And this is the latest after we decided we wanted to get rid of all this lawn here and not have to mow it and get rid of the Japanese stilt grass. This is what it looked like as of last spring. And all of these things flower. These are phlox here. These are asters. These are bee balm. We've got blueberries. We've got black-eyed Susans. We've got liatris. This is obedient plant, which goes crazy. It's a beautiful native plant that has these long spikes of purple flowers, and it just expands like crazy. So if you want to plant something that's low maintenance and easy and beautiful and attracts a lot of pollinators, obedient plant. I did not expect it. I mean, we actually have to figure out what to do with it this year because it's going crazy. And then we also planted red osier dogwoods back here, a bunch of viburnums. So we just went crazy and planted a bunch of stuff. And how we converted this lawn into this habitat is we just collected cardboard for a couple months and just laid cardboard down and then just piled 4 inches of mulch on top of it, which you can often get for free. Many towns have mulch piles. And we just loaded up the pickup with a couple mulch loads and just covered the whole thing, and we haven't had any problems with weeds. We just planted right into the cardboard. It was super easy, and it's worked out really well. Okay, so here's our results. We've had in this snag here, we had a nice hole in the top of the snag. We got 2 downy woodpecker nests and 1 flicker nest, and we've got to watch some battle royales between starlings and flickers as they're like throwing each other out of the nest hole in the spring and like trying to claim dominance over that territory. In the wintertime, the sycamores produce those little sycamore balls, and there's always a couple months every winter where the goldfinches just go nuts, and they're just like out there, and it's snowing these little pieces of the sycamore balls because they use them in the wintertime. So another great use of, people think about habitat in the summer, but it actually, some of this stuff is very valuable in the wintertime. We actually also have a big holly tree right here that produces a tremendous crop of holly every year, and nothing touches it until February every year. And this year it was January, it was last week. And then during that week, all the robins just descend on this holly tree and they just go crazy on it for like 3 days at a time and then clean out the whole thing of berries. So they have value, but you don't think they do if you're not really paying attention to when they're getting used. We've had a flying squirrel back here that we found in one of our nest boxes once. Several red fox, possum, and we've had over 80 species of bird that we've seen from our backyard. And that includes a couple rarities, like for instance right now we're hosting a rufous hummingbird. It's a bird that should be down in Central America right now, and for some reason there's kind of an explosion, meaning there's like 30 birds in the mid-Atlantic right now, of rufous hummingbirds. And so this little lady has been coming to our feeder. We had her banded and everything, and she's been there for at least the last month and a half. So it's really nice. We've also had a white-winged crossbill, not at this house, but a house down the street that we used to live at. And that was a bird that hadn't been seen in Maryland for 15 years. And it came to our feeder for a good 3 months. And we had lots of birders come out and see it and photograph it and stuff. So it pays off. You can see cool stuff if you're paying attention to what's showing up in your yard. Lots of goldfinches, lots of insects, of course, using the pollinator gardens. We've had our rabbit nest with 3 babies. It was fun to watch them just jumping around the yard together in the spring when they were little. We did have a song sparrow nest in my neighbor's shrub that we've taken credit for. The gray catbirds have nested in the habitat islands and in our yew tree. And then the new planted areas, what we found is that because there's still lots of open ground between the shrubs that we've planted, the birds really, this one particular area, they use it like crazy to ant. And if you're not familiar with anting, it's a really cool behavior. In the sunshine, the birds will lay down and splay out their wings and their tail on the ground and just lay there and let the ants crawl up onto them and eat all the parasites out of their feathers. And they need an open ground to do that. And so every spring now, in early summer, the birds use that one particular area for anting. So another, what's that?
Because there's an anthill there.
There could maybe we've attracted the anthill. I don't know, but I've also heard that birds will do it just in the sun to let the sun, sort of like the UV, kind of damage the parasites. And it is kind of a little bit of a sun air spot there too, so I'm not really sure. But it's a cool behavior. And then also think about your neighbors. If you're friendly with your neighbors, engage them in this process. It gets them on board and a little bit more receptive to what you're trying to do with all this messiness in the backyard. Because together you can create something much bigger than you can on your own property. And then finally, the keeping wildlife safe section. Keeping your cats indoors is probably one of the biggest things that you can do. Outdoor and feral cats literally kill hundreds of millions of birds and billions of small animals every single year. It doesn't matter if they have a bell on their neck. It doesn't matter if they're well fed. They kill anyway. It's just their instincts to do it. Lately, American Bird Conservancy has been doing these studies where they actually put a little camera on people's cats, and they're like, "Oh, my cat, she's too old. She doesn't even have claws. She doesn't eat anything. Don't worry about it." And they put a little camera, and sure enough, that cat is killing animals, even though it has no claws and it has a bell. So keep your cats inside. They are not a natural predator. You'll hear that argument a lot. It's like, this is just nature. And it's like, well, no, because cats were never here. 3,000 years ago, cats were not here. We brought them here. So for more information, ABC has a whole Cats Indoors campaign, the American Bird Conservancy. Check them out. Also think about, when you're thinking about your edges, beware the edge effect, where you have a hard edge especially, but any edge really will attract more predators and parasites. Cowbirds are a native bird that's actually expanded its range a lot in recent years. They will go and search out native bird nests, and they'll knock out the eggs and lay their own egg in its place. And the cowbird will grow to be about that big. And I've seen Carolina wrens, which are about that big, feeding these giant fledgling cowbirds. And so it ends up that the native bird puts all of its energy into raising this cowbird at the expense of its own young. So cowbirds will they'll focus in especially along edges to find these nests. Predators too, we think, like I said earlier, they kind of call it trap lining. They just hang out along the edge and just kill nests as they find them. They develop a search image. So if you can help the birds hide their nests a little bit better, they're going to be less vulnerable to being predated by things like raccoons. And then, so what we talked about, this softening the edges provides more cover. It also creates more habitat. Ideally, you'd want to have a situation that looks like this. Like if your clear cut's over here, you're going to move up in progression from grass all the way to your forest. And you can not see it so well, but this kind of shows some of the different species that you'd see in these different habitat types. And then if you actually do have the opportunity to create a meadow, and you're going to need to maintain that meadow. So it does need to be mowed every couple years or so. Ideally, just a portion of the meadow would be mowed every other year or every 3 years or something, so that you always have different stages of meadow succession. But think about the fact that things breed in the meadow. So try to mow outside of the breeding season. So that generally means April to August. So let things grow during that period. Mow in the fall, mow in the early spring. I have seen, this is just like an image that's burned in my memory. We were up in northern Minnesota once driving around, and there were all these bobolinks, which are these beautiful little birds that look like they're wearing backwards tuxedos, like they have these white backs and black fronts. And we drove by these beautiful hay fields, and then came back, and I saw that a farmer had come through and cut his hayfield, which he needs to do. I totally understand that they need to do that. So he cut his hayfield, and there were all these female bobolinks running around on the ground with billfuls of insects, and just running around desperately trying to find where their nest was. So I know that needed to happen because we need to, obviously we need to balance agriculture with everything else. But if you have an area that's just for wildlife and you have control over when you mow, then try to mow outside of the breeding season. And like I said, only mow a portion each year. And so these are just out of your book. This shows some of the different habitat elements that you might consider when you're assessing your own property. I don't know if you've already gone through some of the exercises, okay, of looking at your property and assessing the potential. You can also think about where you have good wildlife, you also have good recreation potential, because people like seeing it. People like just, sitting out there and watching birds come to your feeder, or sitting around the campfire and enjoying the sounds of wildlife around you. And then this is my final slide. This is one of my favorite quotes that I always use when I approach any kind of habitat enhancement or restoration. And this is by the great Aldo Leopold, who is one of the foremost conservationists from the 1930s on. And he said, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." And I think those are just great words. If you're, whatever decision that you're making, you can ask yourself this question: does it preserve integrity, stability, and beauty? If the answer is yes, you're probably doing the right thing. And so with that, I'll take any questions.
Question.
Yeah.
I know she talked a lot about building things for smaller animals to go in.
Mm-hmm.
How do I get groundhogs to leave my neighbor's garages and sheds and go into my wooded area so that they could build their own?
Build yourself your own little garage.
Well, they're not in my garage, but they're in my neighbor's garage.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would guess that they're attracted to something that's a little bit older. Are your neighbor's sheds a little older? Like maybe less
One of them
used?
is, yeah.
Yeah, so like structures like that are generally attractive to wildlife. So if yours is newer, they're going to go to the older one. So the only thing I could suggest is to find some way to make a habitat that's more attractive than what your neighbor's offering. Or kill the groundhog. I don't know. Oh my God. Any other questions?